Your Creative Push, episode 277.
I think a real key to making it and being successful as a creative person is to have a bit of persistence and even doggedness. You're in it for the long haul.
Welcome to Your Creative Push, the podcast that pushes you to pursue your creative passions. I'm your host, Youngman Brown, and my guest today is Matt Madden. Matt is a cartoonist and teacher, best known for his book, 99 Ways to Tell a Story, Exercises, and Style. He's been teaching comics for over 10 years, primarily at the School of Visual Arts in Manhattan, but also at schools, libraries, and museums all around the world. And he has collaborated with his wife, Jessica Abel, on 2 comics textbooks, Drawing Words and Writing Pictures, and Mastering Comics. And Jessica Abel, you might remember, was also on the podcast back in episode 179, a very powerful, awesome episode that you should definitely check out, as well as today's episode with Matt, which is very powerful. Matt talks about not just his book, 99 Ways to Tell a Story, and how he got initially interested in that, but also how he got his start with art and cartoons. It was actually a later start, and he gives his encouragement to people that it is never too late to start a creative passion. Never. But Matt takes us deep into his journey with that book, Exercises in Style, and how giving yourself rules or constraints can really help you to get past the fear of the blank page, and also how he has come to terms with certain limitations of his own creative process and pace. Matt also shares some actionable advice for anyone wanting to implement some limitations or constraints in their own work, and his advice to people who might feel like they got into their creative passion too late and are maybe, quote, behind pace. Just a great conversation with somebody who thinks about the creative process in a very different way. He really stretches his abilities to be able to do things that maybe are out of his comfort zone, but he also gives himself limitations and constraints in very creative and unique ways that I can't wait for you to hear about. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy my conversation with Matt Madden. Matt, welcome to Your Creative Push.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here, man. So I like to give my guests an opportunity at the beginning to sort of give a brief summary and overview of how you got to the point you are today, creatively speaking.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm turning 50 this year, so I've been at it for quite a while now. And I started what seemed kind of late at the time. Like in my late teens, I just started. I was in college and I was studying comparative literature and getting into film. And started to get really into comics, pretty late in life. Like most kids, read superhero comics when they're kids, and grew up to become cartoonists. Not most kids, but most cartoonists have that background. And but in my case, I'd read some comics, but it was something that I came to kind of late. But I got really heavily into it at this time, which is the pre-dawn of the internet era. There was no internet. There was barely any email yet. But what there was a very vibrant mail art scene where people would share stuff through the mail, and it was just like fanzines and photocopied, comic books and zines about music and film and diary stuff and things like that. So I got into that scene and just started making my own stuff and teaching myself as I went. As I said, I was studying literature. I don't have a studio art background at all. But I really liked stories, and I really liked drawing and the sort of compositional aspect that I was learning from film and from studying this wide variety of comics I was discovering, from old newspaper comics to European art comics to underground comics, and these more sort of personal and scribbly mini comics that were kind of big in the 80s and 90s. And eventually I started making longer and longer work, and I did a couple of graphic novels that came out in the late, at the turn of the century, shall we say. And it was a process of learning and figuring stuff out as I went. And then in the early 90s, I was living in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I was working in a bookstore after college. And a coworker and friend of mine gave me this book called Exercises in Style by Raymond Queneau. And he actually gave me the French edition, because this was the original Borders bookstore chain, which no longer exists.
I remember that.
Yeah. And the original store was in Ann Arbor, and I worked in store 001. Cool. Before it was even a big chain. There were like 8 stores when I was working there. And so I had a French literature section, and a friend of mine knew that I had studied French and gave me this book where Raymond Queneau tells the same very short anecdote 99 times. And each time he uses a different point of view or a different writing style. He even does, or he'll do like a sonnet version or a haiku version. He also does things like Pig Latin and spoonerisms and, phonetic French spoken with a very thick English accent and stuff like that. And I found that book to be very inspiring because of the humor of it and the creativity, and also the challenge, the idea of setting yourself a task like that seemed really interesting to me. To say, I'm going to redo this thing 99 times, and see if I can make it the whole way. And I almost instantaneously decided I was going to do that myself, but do it in the form of comics, because I understood right away that comics also uses a lot of these same tropes from literature, things like voice and different genres that you can work in, but also has this whole visual tradition to it as well, where there are different styles you can play with, more or less realistic, or the styles we associate with different genres like superheroes or humor comics. And then this third aspect of comics, which is the grammar and syntax of comics, the design element, the way that it's not just words and drawings randomly placed on a page, but everything's carefully laid out in some sort of grid, with some kind of flow to it. And those are things that you can also manipulate, for example, to make a comic that reads in a circle. If you lay all the images and panels in a certain way, the reader will understand that they need to keep on reading this story in a circle or in a spiral or in some unusual way. So I was off and running, and this is in 1992 or 3 that I discovered this book. And I didn't even start working on my comic until 1998 or 9, because I was still learning. I knew I wasn't ready yet. So it became a very long-term project. And I finished drawing the book in 2004, and it was published the next year. And that book really is the book sort of established me as an author, and that I've just personally I felt was my first real creative breakthrough, where I was like, okay, I've found something that really suits my approach, my ideas about creativity, the challenge of it, the playfulness of it, the idea of working on a series of repeated variations on a theme. That book is still in print, and it keeps on getting foreign editions. It's got about 7 or 8 foreign editions to date, and I actually just in the process of signing contracts for Korean and Chinese editions, believe it or not.
Oh, cool!
So that's been very gratifying. As I was working on this project, and I read more about Raymond Queneau, the author of the original book, and I learned that he was part of this group that he had founded in 1960 called Oubapo, which is a French acronym for a French term, which is Workshop for Potential Literature, is more or less how it translates. And I discovered that he and other like-minded authors and mathematicians and other kinds of intellectuals had this group since 1960 that still exists, although Raymond Queneau died in the 70s. The Italian author Italo Calvino was a member. Marcel Duchamp was a member, and the famous French novelist Georges Perec, among other people. And their project was basically to get together once a month, which they've been doing for 56 years now. Once a month, they have a dinner with lots of wine and good French food, and they talk about creativity and using constraints and rules to create poetry, to create novels, to create short stories. And they sort of have an ongoing catalog of different ideas for exercises, for challenges, things like the Exercise and Style Project. The most famous example of the work that's come out of this project is a novel by Georges Perec called La Disparition, The Disappearance. It was actually translated very freely as A Void by the English poet Gilbert Adair. And that's a 300-page novel, kind of a mystery. It's almost like an Agatha Christie mystery novel. It's very fun and playful. And you can almost forget as you're reading it that it doesn't use the letter E a single time. And that's actually a literary form that dates back to the ancient Greeks called a lipogram. And you can find examples throughout the history of literature from ancient Greece, from medieval Spain, even early 20th century US novelists did this, where you try and write a very long text without using one or more letters. And it's a great exercise to really defamiliarize the everyday act of writing. I recommend if anyone is just sort of curious about what I'm talking about here. Just try to write like a paragraph, just like write it, or think about yourself, or do it like a diary entry. Try doing it without using the letter E, which is the most common letter in English, and even more so in French, where French, has a gender system in the language. So imagine all the words that end with E that are feminine endings have an E on them. You would think it would be completely impossible, but in fact, he managed to pull it off. And not only that, but for 350 pages. And so seamlessly that when the book came out in 1969, famously, it got a review in a major literary journal in France. And the reviewer didn't realize that there was a lipograph. There was no E in there. He's like, oh, well, this is a pretty good new novel by Georges Perec. It's sort of a mystery. And I don't know, but didn't realize that it was there. And that's how you get used to these kinds of weird dodges that you come up with to express things without some of the most common words and sounds in the language.
Right. Yeah, it's missing something. I can't put my finger on it.
Yeah. So since I discovered that, I started, and as I was finishing up the Exercises in Style book, I started working on various other experiments in this mode. And I even discovered that in France, ironically, just around the same time I was discovering Raymond Queneau, a bunch of French colleagues of mine had started something called Oubapo, which is the Workshop for Potential Comics. And it's an officially approved offshoot of the Oulipo group. So it's the same kind of principle, but applied to comics. So it was like right up my alley. So I instantly reached out to them and sent them my book, and they ended up publishing the French edition with the publishing house that they're associated with in France. And from then, almost everything I've done since then has been really focused by this idea of working with constraints and setting rules for yourself. So whether it's a longer work, like I have a comic book that came out a couple of years ago called Drawn Onward from a small independent publisher called Retrofit Comics, which is based here in Philadelphia. And that's a book that's 32 pages where it's laid out in a kind of mirror palindrome format. So every page has a mirror at the other end of the book. And the centerfold of the book is like a mirror image. It's actually it's a close-up of a man and a woman kissing each other. And where their lips meet is the centerfold of the book. So that's sort of a full-length, very rigid formal experiment. And even if someone asked me to do like a one-page comic for their anthology or an illustration for a magazine, I'll try to come up with some kind of rule that will focus my creativity. And that's one of the many values of it for me as a functional tool of being an artist. Is I rarely have that terror of the blank page when someone's like, oh, you should just do a comic, and I have a day free. What am I going to do? And you look at a blank page and like, all right, I can do anything I want. And that freedom can be paralyzing, paradoxically, because there's just too much choice. So sometimes you need to limit your choice to help focus your creativity. So once you say, well, I'm going to do a story that can read the same story in both directions, you're suddenly really limiting the kind of story you can tell. Something that's like like Madam, my Madam, which is the palindrome, something that you can read in both ways. The question becomes, how do you create something like that where it's not just a sentence that you can read back and forth? A slightly longer one, for example, is go hang a salami, I'm a lasagna hog, right? That's like a slightly longer. You can keep, and Georges Perec, the same author who wrote the novel without an E, is considered to have written, at least in French, the longest palindrome ever written. And it's something like, it's like 10 pages long, and you can actually read it from front to end and then read it from the end back to the front. And it more or less makes sense. It's actually pretty grueling to get through. I've tried. But, so these kind of things, first of all, it's something that instantly gives me a problem to work with instead of having angst about, am I creative enough to do something good, or, just trying to do something off the top of my head, or relying on, whatever random ideas occur to me as I go. Instead, it puts me in a situation of more like a problem solver, where I have a set of problems that I need to figure out. And as I go figuring out those problems, what kind of pages can I create? I'm sticking with Drawn Onward here as an example. What kind of page layouts can I do that can easily be read in two directions, but not so simple that they're all just completely symmetrical? it still needs to look visually interesting and engaging. And what kind of story can I tell that has two characters who are experiencing the same narrative, but one is moving forward in time, the other is essentially moving backward in time. In the case of that book, wrestling with that idea, I almost inevitably had to tell a story about a doomed love affair, right? Because I'm thinking about two people who meet at the middle of the book, and then they necessarily have to go their separate ways because they're kind of experiencing different timelines. So that led me into this kind of unusual Romeo and Juliet kind of scenario. And at that point, I was up and running. I had everything I needed to tell this story. Let's say I didn't start this book saying, I want to do a story about a doomed love affair. It's not something that would sort of naturally occur to me. But once the structure kind of suggested it, it gave me some interesting material to work with. And that gave me what kind of characters to draw, what they would look like, what kind of interactions they would have. So that's another aspect of starting from a rule is you're not, I think a lot of people have an idea of starting a work of art, a short story, for example. It's like, well, I need a character and I need, a conflict, something that happens to them that changes their life. And I rarely begin a work from that point of view. I will start with some kind of structure, a palindrome or something where every page, one line of dialogue has to be repeated on the following page. Some kind of, structure that will that'll create a puzzle-like, aspect to the creative process. And it's by solving that puzzle that I start to figure out who the characters are going to be, what the conflict's going to be. Because in the end, although I'm using very experimental means, when you read my comics, I think most people will find that they're still pretty conventional or classical stories. I still have characters. There's like a conflict that needs to be resolved by the end of it in some way. I mean, there's a lot farther you can go. You can create really far out art, using rules and constraints as well. But I do like, basically traditional storytelling. But using these experimental means to get started are a way to surprise myself in terms of what kinds of stories I can tell and what kind of characters I invent. And I think also keeps things fresh. It keeps me from just using kind of default ideas. I think we all have kind of received notions about what kind of stories we should be telling or what kind of characters we like to talk about. But when you build yourself a structure that obliges you to follow, some arbitrary rule, you find yourself coming up with characters and stories and situations that you never would have just made up out of whole cloth. They're kind of demanded by the circumstance. And that's something I find very exciting and very refreshing as an artist.
Yeah, and especially when you do 99 different kind of styles about the same thing, I imagine that, you really are able to push your boundaries and test yourself and do things that you never would have tried in any other circumstance. I wonder, it's called exercises in style, but did you also kind of like exercise things out of you? Like, did that forever kind of change the way you looked at things moving forward? And you're like, all right, I never want to do this style again. Like, I got this out of my system. I've learned that this is not a tool that I want to necessarily add to my tool belt.
Yeah, well, yes and no. I mean, definitely it was an opportunity to try a bunch of stuff out. And there are things that I did specifically because I didn't care for them. And it's nothing I would do somewhere else. Like, like I said, I didn't really grow up reading superhero comics, and even the general visual style of superhero comics is not something I'm terribly drawn to. With some exceptions. So doing a superhero version of that story was a way for me to sort of try that hat on and try it on for size. And I think I did a pretty good job of it. But then it's like, all right, so I've done that. I kind of figured out some of the rules and how to draw that way and how to lay out a page that way. I don't really feel like it didn't inspire me to want to do more, necessarily. But on the other hand, because I did these 99 different ways and realized I could do that and I could do more, because clearly I'm not making any pretense that these are the 99 ways to tell a story. The very fact that it's 99, I think, which is the number that I got from Raymond Queneau, suggests that, one more would be 100, and that would be a nice round number. But 99 implies that you can keep going. And I think that's very important to keep in mind, that I'm not saying that I found the 99 ways that you can tell a story. These are 99 of basically an infinite amount of ways you can tell a story. So if there's a downside to that project for me, it's that I'm always aware of that. And again, it's the problem of freedom. Every time I sit down to do a drawing, even if I have some ideas already in mind about the structure, when it comes down to the actual drawing, I'm always thinking like, well, I could draw this in a kind of superhero style, or I could draw it with stick figures, or I could do it with abstract shapes, or I could draw it in the style of an artist I admire. I've never really developed a kind of default drawing style that's sort of a simple, a lot of, if you read comics, especially independent comics and European comics, you'll find that a lot of artists have, think about newspaper strips as well, and TV animation. Artists tend to come up with a sort of shorthand, very straightforward style that is appealing, and it might be primitive, it might be very accomplished, but it's a kind of recognizable style and visual language that they work in over and over again. And that gives you a great freedom to explore all kinds of different stories and situations with a certain graphic style, or even with a certain set of characters, And I've never really settled into I don't have any recurring characters. I don't really have a default style. I mean, except for generally trying to simplify stuff over time. I'm on sort of since I'm self-taught as well, I think of myself as on a very long-term autodidactic voyage, where my ideal would be to be drawing in a very sparse, simple style, something like the New Yorker cartoonist Saul Steinberg. He did just very simple line drawings. He's someone who would walk around his studio staring at the blank page and thinking about it all day. And then at the end of the afternoon, he'd get out his pen and he'd draw like 4 pen strokes, and he would, have a finished drawing. And I love that kind of gestural, there's a lot of thought and process behind it, but the actual drawing is very freely and quickly executed. And I'm a long way off from that, because I was sort of started learning how to draw as I go, and trying to master everything, probably more than I need to. But I've tried to, over the years, figure out, drawing human anatomy, which I'm still just kind of middling at, but I can, pull it off well enough. I've gotten pretty good at like linear perspective. But, again, if you look at a Saul Steinberg drawing, there is no perspective in there. You don't really need to be a perfect representational realist to tell a story. But it's important for me to learn all of its stuff and go through that process of learning everything about drawing and art history and the different ways that narrative can work and function, so that then I can go on. It's like the Picasso is the most famous model, where he was trained as a very academic, traditional artist, and he learned all of that and then started to just jettison all the stuff he didn't want to use, until he ended up with this very simple, primitive style. So I feel like I'm kind of on a voyage like that, and I'm somewhere in like I guess I'm like finishing up my, maybe I'm beginning my junior year in my undergraduate studies in this kind of sense, which is frustrating, because it's like comics is, my particular medium is an extremely slow, it's one of the slowest moving forms of art you can do. Especially when you're doing it all by yourself. I'm not doing like a sort of mainstream production model where you have a script writer, someone who draws pencils, someone who inks those pencils, somebody else who does colors, somebody who does lettering. I do all that stuff myself. And I'm not a particularly fast drafts person. I mean, I have friends who can actually just sit down and whip out a drawing really quickly. And I can't do that. So those are the tools I have. That's like the skills I have that I have to work with. And I'm, sort of made my peace with that in some ways, but it's still, it's a very slow moving thing. And it's a long time before I get that gratification of finishing a project. But on the other hand, like I said, I'm about to turn 50 and I'm still going strong, and I have no intention of finishing, of stopping anytime soon. So, it's just an ongoing process. It's part of my artistic life.
Right. Well, would you have any practical advice for anybody that maybe doesn't experiment too much, or doesn't give themselves limitations? Maybe they still kind of struggle with that fear of the blank canvas. Any kind of practical advice for them to kind of experiment themselves, maybe to incorporate some restraints or limitations in their own kind of creative pursuit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just coming up with some exercises is always a good place to start. So, like I said, even just as a writing exercise, to try and do a lipogram, which is one of the most basic kind of writing constraints, like try and write a paragraph without using an E, or try out, even a combination of letters, maybe write an autobiographical text where you can't use any of the letters in your own name, for example. In terms of drawing or cartooning, There are a lot of things you can do with the way that you draw. So, for example, you might like choose a comic that you like or a drawing that you like and try to redraw it in the style of another artist, or maybe take a Spider-Man page and try to draw it in a Picasso style or something like that. There are kind of visual challenges like that you can do. Something that I find useful is to do little one-page comics that use some kind of simple rule to it that involves the reading path. Like I mentioned before, if you arrange panels in a circle or even in a kind of square, some kind of layout, you'll have to come up with some kind of scenario in those pictures that will be a story that reads in a loop. So that can be kind of an interesting storytelling experiment to see what kind of stories you can do that way. Or doing a visual palindrome, so like I was talking about, go hang a salami on a lasagna hog, and this sort of 32-page book that I did using this principle. But you can also try doing a single page that way. Like, can you do, or even just like a comic strip, like a newspaper strip or a webcomic strip that reads in both directions. So that means that the first panel and the last panel will be the same. The second panel and the second to last panel will be the same, and so on and so forth until you have either one middle panel that can be kind of a pivot, or you have, two panels in the middle that are the same. What kind of story can you tell that will actually make sense that way? That will use that repetition and that sort of backwards and forwards reading in an interesting way. Because they end up being little kind of philosophical allegories about, like the circular comic implies being stuck in a rut, right? So you end up, I've done this with students a lot, and a lot of them end up being people stuck in their life cycle of, getting up and going to work, and then they go get drunk in the bar, and then they throw up, and then they wake up in bed and they have to start the whole cycle over again. So you sort of have to be careful which panels what you choose to draw in those panels, because you're condemning your characters to relive that scenario eternally. So
interesting. Well, does that translate into your music as well? Because you're a musician as well. Do you find yourself kind of implementing some of these like experimentations or trying to limit yourself when it comes to writing a song or creating music?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because I've played music, my whole adult life, and kind of got sidetracked into comics for the last 20 years. And I've come back to making music again in the last few years, and I've been putting some sort of indie rock songs on SoundCloud. Coming back to music after a long time with this sort of new toolkit from Oubapo and this idea of constraints really helped me focus on music more, because music is kind of the original constrained medium. It's the thing about music is that it's entirely based on limits of what notes you play. You have the 12 tones, but in any given song, you're going to be in a key, which limits the numbers of those notes you can play in any given context. You have constraints of what time meter you're going to play in. So it's actually, when you look at music that way, you realize that, and in fact, as an aside, drawn onward, I'm calling it a palindrome, but the original source of that structure actually comes from classical music. And it's a compositional structure that Johann Sebastian Bach used several times, among others, called a cancresan, or a crab canon, which is the same idea of a palindrome, where you have a melody line that might run A, B, C, D. And at the same time, if you look at the musical score, you'll see the same score but running backwards at the same time. So D, C, B, A. And those two melodies play together and create a harmony. But it's actually the same melody, just playing in two directions at the same time. On YouTube, if you look up Bach crab canon, you'll find a neat little video with a MIDI performance that visualizes how these two melodies fit together and form a kind of Mobius strip, sort of a musical eternal Mobius strip. So in terms of the songwriting, I guess I've seen it most explicitly in the lyrics that I've been writing. Like, I've been using some of these ideas of setting rules for myself, or using structures that I've learned from experimental poetry in my lyrics. So like, there's different kinds of poetry structures. There's a haiku is one that everyone knows. But there's a pantoum, which is a more complicated structure where you repeat lines in a sort of interlocking way. And that's a pattern that I've found works well for music, since music, especially when you think about folk songs, has a lot of repetition, right? You have lines that repeat as part of the musical structure. And again, so these things are already there. So it's like bringing these slightly more avant-garde approaches can shed interesting light on something like, a pop song or like a kind of folky rock song or whatever that already has a lot of repetition and rules built into it. It's more like finding little ways to tweak it that I think is interesting.
We've talked a lot about like restraints and limitations setting on yourself for the particular art. I wonder, do you, especially since you got into being an artist like later in life, as you described, did you ever feel like that was kind of like a limitation or a restraint to you? Like, was there ever kind of a resistance to you? Like, did you ever feel like you were like late to the game, or did that ever kind of hold you back in any way?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like I said, I didn't grow up wanting to be a cartoonist or any kind of artist. Honestly, even though I'd always been sort of a creative kid who doodled a lot, and I used to make, model airplanes and stuff like that. That was my big thing when I was a kid. I never really thought about having a creative life. I thought I didn't really know what I was going to do, but I kind of assumed by the time I was in college, I was thinking I'd probably be in academia. I'd be like a teacher or, do something really. I was into language. So I studied linguistics as well. And I thought maybe I'd get into linguistics or translation or something, which is something I do now somewhat, some translation work, which is another kind of constraint that's fun to play with, finding out how to express something in another language in a way that makes sense. And in the case of translation for comics, that actually fits in the word balloons, right? You have to translate visually as well as, but anyway, so I started drawing comics without any real art training, any real knowledge of how the comics world or publishing world worked. And yeah, I very much felt like I was catching up, and I felt, in retrospect, it seems ridiculous, but I probably did my first comic when I was 19 or so, maybe 20. And I felt like, oh man, I really am too late to be getting into this, which is absurd. I mean, you can start stuff at any time. And, I've taught a lot of continuing ed classes over the years at SVA in New York and in different places. And it's always cool to see like older people. Sometimes people come in, who have just retired, and they're like, all right, finally I can start drawing comics or doing whatever kind of art.
Yes.
There really is no bad time to start. And the kind of perspective and generosity of sensibility that you bring when you're an older person who has lived and who has raised children and worked a job brings a real richness to any art form, and comics in particular, which hasn't just not had the kind of social cachet until the last 10, 15 years that people are reading this stuff and reading not just superhero stuff and also not just kind of wild underground stuff that's out to offend you. Which is all good and well, but also ambitious, graphic novel kind of work, memoir, comics. We've really had and are in a really golden age of comics, sort of in all levels. And one of the things that's doing is that it's bringing all kinds of people, including older people, women, people of color, people who used to not even really pay attention to comics or feel like it wasn't really for them to be part of, are entering into this thing and bringing in their different viewpoints. And as I've gotten older, I've been aware of the fact that, I'm no longer part of that young guard of like kids who go to the comics conventions and trade their mini comics and stuff. And I'm not like an acknowledged grandmaster either. There's a certain number of slots for the people who are like, oh, they're the famous cartoonist. I think I'm in a very typical position of creative people of all time, which is that sort of mid-career artist, right? Like I've been at it for a long time, not so long that I'm a sort of household name. I have people who know who I am if you follow comics, but the 99 Ways to Tell a Story came out over 10 years ago now. And Jessica, Abel, my wife, and I went on to make these two textbooks, drawing words and writing pictures, followed by mastering comics, which were huge projects. And then we became the editors of the Best American Comics series for 6 years. And meanwhile, of course, had 2 children and moved to France. We've been very busy. And it's easy to get frustrated and feel like I sort of missed my chance to be an author. I should have done a book right after 99 Ways to Tell a Story. And I did short story. I had a bunch of short stories that I still, short stories, for any writers out there, you probably know this. It's like it's the worst possible thing you can try and do is like sell a short story collection. So that's already kind of hard. And now I do have longer book projects, but it's so slow going in comics, especially for me, that this book I'm working on now, I hesitate to say when it'll be finished and published. So it requires a kind of doggedness to keep going at this age, and feeling like there's a sort of cliche that comics and music too is sort of a young person's game, because it does require such stamina and dedication. And as I got older, I'm realizing that's only part of the truth. It is true that it helps when you're young and you don't have attachments, and you can really just draw all day, or tour with your band or whatever. But as you get older and you have a family, you also get a different perspective on life and the passage of time, and you see several generations coming up behind you. But you also you appreciate the older generations, so people who are my age or even older, who are sometimes, you think have disappeared. Like there have been various cases of, in the comics world, of people who nobody heard of for, 10 years or so. Then they suddenly appear with a new book that they've been working on sort of secretly all these years. And they were just busy living their life and trying to get their work done. And just because you don't see someone on Facebook, showing in their new pages every day doesn't mean they're not hard at work at stuff. And there's definitely a parenting, especially for women artists. There's a parenting donut hole where, in the 30s and 40s, if you have kids, it becomes very difficult to also maintain that level of productivity where you're like, hey, I'm an artist and I go to all these things and I'm part of the art world. You sort of retreat from that social side of the world, or the public side of it. And I think that makes it very easy to fall into a kind of feeling of illegitimacy. They're like, well, I'm not part of that world anymore. I'm not cool anymore. I don't have a good haircut anymore. And I think it's very important to fight that, because you also have a new perspective on life. And if you keep drawing, keep writing, keep working on whatever your craft is, you're getting better as well. And I do, as slow moving as my career has been, I see myself improving, and I see myself pushing in new directions all the time, at a glacial pace sometimes. But but I can every once in a while I can sit and look back at what I've done for the last 10 years. And first of all, see, there's a lot of it, but it's all published in all kinds of different places. And I've done, comics work that's been published in the US, but also in France. I've done a bunch of translation work that's been published online, published in books, published in anthologies. I've been doing this, music work. I've been doing drawing. So I try to keep that in perspective, that like I'm doing stuff at my particular pace. And sometimes it feels a bit weird. Just like a couple weeks ago, there was like some cartoonists get together in Philadelphia, and they're mostly young. And I'm thinking, do they think it's weird that I'm like this, 50-year-old guy who's like showing up with a bunch of, scruffy, I mean, some of them are not that, they're 30 or whatever even, but it's easy to feel like an outsider. And I've been lucky too, just growing up, I've always had friends who were older than me. And I've always known people who, like, when I was living in Austin, Texas in the 90s, I had a good friend who was very much part of the music scene, but he was this, I was in my late 20s, and he was then already in his, mid 50s, and worked at the library, and he would go to punk shows every night. I got to know him from going to see punk shows in Austin, Texas, and he was just this passionate guy who loved music, and he would also go to see jazz and classical and stuff. He was just a very cultured person. He wasn't afraid to maintain that as part of his life, even though he was, could be seen as sort of like this weird doddering old guy to sort of the young snotty punks at the rock shows. And I always really admired that about him and people like him. And it's something that I aspire to. And the corollary to that is being able to age gracefully, in the sense of, maintaining your values and the things that you grew up with, but also being attuned to what these kids are into. It's like, to not get jaded. It's very easy to get stuck in your tastes and believe that, you really have the best, you figured out what the best kind of art is. And this new stuff like web comics or whatever, in comics, there's been a lot of new stuff appearing up in the last 10, 20 years, like in all aspects of culture. You have, stuff on the internet, which has a very different feel, both visually and in terms of the kind of humor, than you find in traditional printed comics. You also have a big influx of Asian work, manga from Japan, and the anime, TV series and movies, all these new sensibilities coming in. And there's a certain kind of person my age and older, and younger than me too, who really just reject that out of hand, have this very reactionary kind of thing. Like, no, I'm not ready to take on new stuff. Like, I know what I like, and I'm going to stick with it, And I try, and I understand that, because it gets tiring. It's like, oh, another new style is getting popular. It's hard to keep up with things, and I don't keep up with everything, but I try to keep an open mind to all this stuff, and look for ways that it relates to what's come before and the stuff that I value. But it's a struggle. It's like an ongoing. It takes effort.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's one of those kind of perfectly acceptable excuses for people, if they have kids, or if they have a career change, or they switch to a different type of art, like you said, stopping music for a long period of time, then getting back into it. I think it's a perfectly acceptable excuse to most people. Like, all right, there's been too long of a gap. I'm too far out of the game, and just getting back to it is just, it's over. Like, a gap is unacceptable. But it really is as easy as just coming back to where you left off. It's not like you're missing semesters of school and you can't just go to senior year. You just pick up right where you left off. And perhaps, yes, things have changed, but instead of seeing that kind of the way the world has changed as a bad thing, see it as an opportunity to learn new things, and to kind of see how that meshes with your own style and your own values, like you said.
Yeah. And I was thinking more generally with music in particular, because I'm coming to it at a very late age relatively, and I'm not doing stuff that you expect from a middle-aged man. It's not like I'm not doing folksy country music or some kind of old guy music. I'm basically doing the same kind of music I like when I was in 20s, sort of offbeat, post-punky pop stuff. But I like it. I feel like I have doing it, with my experience and with the time I've spent listening to music and playing guitar. I have a conviction behind what I'm doing now that I didn't really have when I was younger, when I was less sure of myself creatively. And that's something that I do think comes with age, and in addition to practice. And I was thinking how when I was, a teenager, it became sort of running joke, sort of, early 80s, late 70s, when the original kind of dinosaurs of rock, when the Rolling Stones would go on tour, and there'd be all these jokes that, oh my God, Mick Jagger, he's so over the hill, and he's 60 years old. It's I don't know, he seemed impossibly old back then. But if you think I haven't gone back to look at the dates, but I mean, he was born in the early 40s or something. I mean, he must have been, maybe 60, 65 years old by the mid 80s. And people are like, can you believe this old guy is out there, making rock? And the Who were doing their final tour and stuff like that. Actually, I saw them in 1982, and they seemed like, oh yeah, they probably should cut it off, call it quits now. They're in their late 40s, and here they are, we're and now it's, 30 years later, and most of these guys are still out there making music. I think Mick Jagger just announced 2 days ago that he's going to stop performing. And I don't even know how, he must be 80 years old by now or something, or late 70s, And then you see people like, Johnny Cash or whatever, these people who had these amazing creative flowerings, late on in their career. And meanwhile, there's still plenty of teenagers making incredible music. But I feel like music and pop and rock stuff in particular, we're really past the age of the teenager. We're in a new age where it's not so youth directed necessarily. We have an understanding that, certain kinds of pop culture, whether it's comic books, rock and roll, hip hop, I think we're just getting to that age where the first generations of hip hop guys are getting to be really old, it'll be interesting to see how that whole culture ages as well. But I feel like you start to find this new way, it'll be whatever, the BB King, there'll be some, Ice Cube's, club of hip hop in Las Vegas or something, they'll find some way to make it real throughout your life and find ways to make it relevant.
Yeah. And that's why that whole too late excuse, I think, is just, it's just ridiculous, because
exactly.
There's no such thing. It's not like a athletic career where you miss your prime and you just can't show up and try out for the Philadelphia Phillies as a 70-year-old. Actually, maybe the Phillies could use some 70-year-olds, but, it's just, it's not like a physical thing. It's all just the kind of mental energy you put into it. And it's never too late to start something or to continue something.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. I mean, Jessica and I, since we've taught a lot and we talk a lot about creativity and stuff, and we try to sort of read what the latest trends are and ideas and stuff. And there's always a back and forth which isn't at all black and white, but the sort of 10,000 hours of practice to get to Carnegie Hall idea, and versus the either you got it or you don't, idea. And I think clearly the idea is the truth is somewhere in the middle. Like there's definitely some place for talent. Like I've definitely seen young people and older students who've come into my classes who just have a knack for drawing things really well, or a way of thinking about story structure or writing in a way that comes basically naturally to them. Some of those same people never do anything with it because they don't practice, they don't build on it, they don't develop it. Natural talent can be a trap too, I think, because you see people all the time who are really good at something, so they don't really push themselves. They're like, well, I don't really need to push. In some ways, that's been my case with guitar playing, because I learned guitar. I taught myself when I was like 14 years old, and I got good at it very fast. But at a basic level, where I'm a good mimicker. I play by ear, and I could listen to almost any song and figure it out. And here, years later, I'm like, I was a bit cocky. I knew how to be a good monkey guitar player. And, what I've been doing the last, 10 years when I've been really getting into jazz and, old Brazilian music and things like that, and modern classical stuff. And finally kind of understanding some of the reasons and theory behind all that stuff. And it's really enriched my understanding and my playing in a way that I won't say I regret, because I think I did the stuff I wanted to do when I was a kid, and that's fine. It's not, there's not any one correct way to do it. But I do kind of look back and I think like, if it hadn't been so easy for me to learn, maybe I would have had to try harder and find more teachers, and that would have led to a richer, experience.
Well, before we get to the final push, I was wondering, you have a course coming up, is that correct?
Yeah, so if anyone's interested in exploring some of these ideas of working with constraints with me in a narrative and visual context, I'm going to be running a online course administered by the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts continuing ed program from, I think it's March 5th to May 7th. So it'll be asynchronous. It'll be an online class with a few online meetings. And it's the first time I've done this. I'm looking forward to it. But it'll be a workshop where we'll develop, everyone will develop their own project. It could be comics, or it could be illustrated narrative. It could even be like a short story or something. And I'll sort of coach you, and we'll have group discussions and try and put some of these ideas into practice. And the deadline for signing up for it is February 16th, I think. Just want to put that out there if you want to sign up. It's, if you go to pafa.org, I think it is, you can find the continuing ed and look up by my name. You should be able to find it. Maybe you can, I don't know if you'll put that on the link on your website or something.
Yep. We'll have that linked up at today's show notes page, yourcreativepush.com/Matt Madden. Matt, it is time for the final push. And that's where I ask you to reach through the microphone and just grab the shoulder of one of the listeners that you've already really inspired today, and just give them your best final words of advice and really push them to pursue their own creative passions.
All right. Well, I thought about talking about, obviously, that I think using constraints and rules is a great solution for creativity and for advancing as an artist. But instead, what I really want to say, and which I've already, what I've been talking about, is that I think a real key to making it and being fulfilled and happy and even successful as a creative person is to have a bit of persistence and even doggedness. You're in it for the long haul. There are very few things that have an immediate payoff, and if you're really into art, you're going to want to do it for your whole life. And that's going to be hard. And art, very few forms of art, creative practices really make money. Maybe they pay for themselves. Maybe you'll get lucky and make money once in a while, but you should really be doing it because it's your vocation. It's what you need to be doing for your own good, and that's my case. And when I look at the sort of people falling by the wayside as I get older and look around me, and I think, why am I still here? Why am I able to still do this and get better? Because I don't necessarily have the native talent that some people have. And I also don't have the insane work ethic that other people have. I think I've always been leery of getting too down a rabbit hole of like giving yourself insane deadlines and pulling all-nighters and stuff like that. I think it's very unhealthy. And I'm constitutionally very lazy. I really like to just like hang out and have a cocktail and watch a movie or read a book. And so the thing that's kept me going is a kind of doggedness. I just sort of like, digging my heels in and just like, I'm going to do this and I'm going to keep on working on it. I'm going to try and be systematic about it, but I'm going to forgive myself if I don't actually follow my game plan the way I originally planned to. But the most important thing is that I'm determined. I have this determination to just slowly keep, pushing forward. Slow and steady wins the race, as they say.
I couldn't agree more, man. Well, dude, thank you so much, Matt, for coming on the show today, for giving us that push, sharing your story, and helping us out. I really appreciate it, man. My
pleasure. It was a great chat.
Yep. And you can find Matt on his website, which is mattmadden.com. On Facebook, he is Matt Mad, MattMadd. And we will have that as well as everything we talked about today, including the online course, if you want to sign up for that, listed again at today's show notes page, yourcreativepush.com/mattmadden. Matt, thanks again.
Thanks a lot.
Boom, another great episode in the books. My thanks once again to Matt for coming on the show and sharing his journey. Hopefully during that episode you were thinking about the constraints or limitations that you could perhaps give to yourself in your art or in your creativity. I know for me, I was thinking about my words plus music videos, and I realized how much constraint there is with that. There's only a certain amount of time that I get to kind of tell my story. And within that, there's only a certain amount of words that I'm able to use, and I have to use them in a certain frequency. It was really interesting to kind of put myself in Matt's shoes. So hopefully you were able to think about your own creative thing, whatever it happens to be, and maybe thought of some ways that you can push yourself to give yourself some rules that you can play with. And on the flip side, maybe you were also inspired to venture into some other styles that you never thought that you would ever try, just to maybe either get them out of your system or to try to learn something out of it. Maybe give yourself a self-imposed 30-day challenge or 100-day challenge to try to tell the same story like Matt does in his book in many different types of ways. And I think doing something like that will really push your boundaries. It will really push you into thinking of new ways to approach your art by diving into these other styles, by diving into things that you would never think of doing in order to try to tell this same story, in order to try to say the same thing, just in a different way. And let's actually continue that conversation in the Facebook group. I'm going to have a specific post up there with a specific question for you guys. Let's do something fun this week, and let's do it in lipogram form so you can't use the letter E, okay? I'm going to start the thread out with my lipogram here with this prompt. What blocks do you run into with your art, and do you knowingly submit your art to any constraints? So you can answer one or both of those questions in the Facebook group. You can get directly to that post by going to yourcreativepush.com/lipogram. That's LIPOGRAM. And my thanks to Matt for giving us that inspiration. Make sure you do not use the letter E in your answer just for fun. On next week's episode, we have Jeff Leisowitz. Jeff is an award-winning musician, producer, a college instructor, a critically acclaimed author, and internationally distributed filmmaker who has devoted his life to the art of creativity. He recently published his first book, Not Effing Around, the No BS Guide for Getting Your Creative Dreams Off the Ground. And he comes on the show next week to talk about that book and many of the tricks that he suggests to get past the ick, the inner critic. We call it resistance, he calls it the ick. So a really great talk with him. Definitely falls perfectly in line with Your Creative Push, and I know you're going to be inspired by him. If you want to find out more about Jeff before the episode, you can head to his website, jeffleisowitz.com. That's JeffLeisawitz.com. Or we'll have that linked up at today's show notes page, as well as everything we talked about today with Matt at yourcreativepush.com/277. But that's all I've got for you today, so hopefully you were inspired to go and get your work done. So go and get it done, and we will be here for you next week if you need that push again. We'll see you in the Facebook group, yourcreativepush.com/lipogram, and we will continue the discussion there. Go get some amazing work done. I love you guys so much, and we will see you next week. Bye. Never miss a push. Head to yourcreativepush.com/subscribe to find the easiest way for you to subscribe to the podcast.